Picture a world divided. The Cold War era is in full swing. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, vie for dominance. This isn't a tale of a physical battlefield, but rather an ideological one. A war fought not with bullets, but with beliefs. On one side, the United States championing capitalism and democracy, and on the other, the Soviet Union, steadfast in its commitment to communism and a state-controlled economy. As the arms race escalates, the burden on the Soviet Union grows. The economy, already strained under the weight of a centralized system, buckles further under the immense costs of maintaining military parity with the United States. Add to this the quagmire of the Afghan War, a conflict that drained the Soviet Union's resources and morale, and the stage is set for change. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. Rising to power in 1985, Gorbachev is a breath of fresh air in the stagnant political landscape of the Soviet Union. He brings with him two revolutionary policies: perestroika, or restructuring, and glasnost, or openness. Perestroika, aimed at reforming the Soviet economy, seeks to shift the gears of production from the hands of the state to the private sector. Meanwhile, glasnost, a policy of increased transparency and freedom of speech, is introduced to foster a sense of trust and openness between the government and its people. Gorbachev's policies are well-intentioned. He hopes to revitalize the Soviet Union, to bring it back from the brink of economic collapse. But change is never easy, and it's especially difficult within a system as rigid as the Soviet Union's. As the reforms take hold, they expose the deep-seated corruption, inefficiencies, and inequalities that have been festering within the Soviet Union for decades. Despite his best efforts, Gorbachev's reforms would inadvertently lead to the unraveling of the Soviet Union. The year is 1989. The Berlin Wall, a symbol of division and the Cold War, crumbles. This was not just an architectural breakdown, but a symbolic dissolution of the barriers that had once split the world into two distinct halves. The Berlin Wall, a concrete embodiment of the Cold War, had for years divided East and West Berlin. Its fall was more than a physical collapse. It was the symbolic shattering of an era of ideological divide. The ripples of this monumental event were not confined to Germany. They spread far and wide, shaking the very foundations of the Soviet Union. The crumbling of the Berlin Wall was a catalyst, igniting a chain reaction that would eventually bring down the Soviet Union. One by one, the dominoes began to fall. The people of the Eastern Bloc, inspired by the events in Berlin, started to demand their own freedom. The Iron Curtain, which had kept them isolated for so long, was beginning to tear. First came Poland, where the Solidarity movement led a successful push for democratic change. Then Hungary, where the people tore down the physical barrier along their border with Austria, effectively opening the Iron Curtain. This was followed by Czechoslovakia, where the Velvet Revolution led to the end of 41 years of communist rule, and Bulgaria, where a peaceful revolution brought an end to nearly half a century of a Soviet-style political system. These revolutions, each a domino falling in the grand scheme of things, signaled the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. The Eastern Bloc, once a monolith of Soviet influence, was fragmenting. The people, once oppressed, were now rising, demanding democracy, freedom, and independence. The Soviet Union, once a superpower, was now facing its own mortality. As the revolution swept across Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union could do little but watch as its sphere of influence crumbled. With the Eastern Bloc countries gaining independence, the Soviet Union found itself increasingly isolated. The dominoes had begun to fall, and the end was now just a matter of time. As the 90s dawned, the Soviet Union was on borrowed time. The economic crisis that had been brewing beneath the surface was now impossible to ignore. Inflation was rampant, and the once mighty ruble was in free fall. The Soviet people, who had long been promised prosperity, were now facing the stark reality of economic collapse. While the Soviet Union was spiraling into chaos, a new leader was emerging on the scene, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was a charismatic figure, a stark contrast to the old guard in the Kremlin. He was willing to challenge the status quo, and his calls for economic and political reform resonated with a population desperate for change. In August of 1991, hardliners within the Soviet government, alarmed by the rapid pace of change, attempted a coup. Their objective was to oust Mikhail Gorbachev, the then Soviet leader, and halt the reforms. But the coup was poorly executed and ultimately failed. The attempted power grab only served to accelerate the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The final nail in the coffin came in December of that year, with the signing of the Belavesia Accords. This agreement, signed by the leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, declared that the Soviet Union was dissolved and replaced by the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Accords effectively signaled the end of the Soviet Union, a reality that was formally recognized on December 26, 1991. The Soviet Union, once a titan on the world stage, was now a relic of the past. Its collapse sent shockwaves around the globe, reshaping the geopolitical landscape. The Cold War was over and a new era had begun. And so, the Soviet Union, once a superpower that commanded the world's attention, ceased to exist. The final years were a time of dramatic change and upheaval, marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in world history. In the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, the world was forever changed. The immediate aftermath was a tumultuous period, marked by economic hardship and a struggle for identity for the 15 newly independent states. The Soviet command economy was dismantled, and a market economy was attempted. But this transition was far from smooth. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and a significant drop in living standards were the harsh realities faced by millions. On the political front, the power vacuum left by the Soviet Union led to a shift in the international balance. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, with its economic and military might unrivaled. This new unipolar world saw the American model of liberal democracy and capitalism promoted as the gold standard. However, it also meant the absence of a counterbalance, leading to unchecked American influence in global affairs. The geopolitical landscape was redrawn. Former Soviet states sought to carve out their own path. Some leaned west, seeking integration with Europe and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Others, like Belarus and Central Asian countries, maintained closer ties with Russia. This tug-of-war for influence continues to this day, a testament to the lingering shadow of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Russia, the heart of the former Soviet Union, faced its own challenges. The 90s were a decade of economic turmoil, political instability, and a struggle to redefine itself on the world stage. The country emerged from this period as a federation, still grappling with the legacy of its past. Internationally, the end of the Cold War led to a shift in focus. Issues like human rights, climate change, and globalization took center stage. The ideological battle of capitalism versus communism was replaced by a complex web of new challenges and opportunities. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a seismic event that continues to shape the world we live in today. Its echoes reverberate in the geopolitics, economies, and societies of the post-Soviet states and beyond, a poignant reminder of a world that once was, and its profound impact on the world that is. The collapse of the Soviet Union serves as a stark reminder of the impermanence of power. It's a tale that echoes throughout history, echoing the rise and fall of empires, kingdoms, and nations. The Soviet Union's collapse, however, is unique in its context, providing invaluable lessons for the modern world. First, the warning bell rings for the dangers of economic mismanagement. The Soviet Union, despite its military might and vast resource pool, struggled with a stagnant economy. The centralized, planned economy stifled innovation and competition, leading to inefficiencies and widespread corruption. It's a cautionary tale for any nation that underestimates the power of a dynamic, market-driven economy. Second, the collapse underlines the peril of ignoring societal changes. The Soviet Union was rigid, resistant to change, and dismissive of the growing demand for freedom and democracy. It was a system that suppressed dissent and stifled individuality, a stark contrast to the burgeoning global trend towards individual rights and liberties. When the pressure from the people became too much to bear, the societal structure crumbled, proving that a nation's strength lies not in its tanks and missiles, but in the hearts and minds of its people. And lastly, the Soviet Union's collapse underscores the importance of diplomacy and international relations. The Cold War era was marked by a dangerous arms race and intense geopolitical competition. Yet, it was diplomacy, not warfare, that ultimately led to the end of the Soviet Union. It's a lesson that highlights the power of dialogue and cooperation in resolving international conflicts. The Soviet Union's legacy is a complex tapestry of triumphs and failures, of power and collapse. It's a chapter in our history that continues to shape global politics and economics, reminding us of the consequences of unchecked power, economic mismanagement, and societal suppression. In the end, the Soviet Union's collapse offers a timeless lesson that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune from collapse when faced with internal strife and external pressures.